British troops ate whatever survived transport, rationing, and weather. A rough mix of tins, substitutes, and surprises that shaped daily life. 1. Reconstituted powdered egg. Reconstituted powdered egg usually gets described as if everyone accepted it without complaint, though that never really held up. The stuff turned up everywhere in the camps, and it caught new recruits off guard. They'd be told breakfast was eggs, only to watch a cook tip a tin of yellow dust into a bucket, add water, and stir until it looked like something scraped from the bottom of a paint mixer. You'd expect people to get used to it after a while. Most didn't. Soldiers who served in the early 1940s talked about it like it was its own category of food, separate from anything a chicken had ever produced. The army leaned on it because real eggs simply couldn't be moved or stored on the scale they needed. A crate of fresh ones might last a week if you were lucky. Powdered egg could sit in a storeroom for months. That solved the supply issue, even if the taste problem never really budged. Some accounts mention cooks experimenting with salt, tinned tomatoes, anything to distract from the rubbery texture. It rarely worked. A few units even tried folding it into puddings, which raised different questions entirely. Every now and then you'll find a note from a quartermaster praising the stuff for its reliability, which reads oddly when set next to the nicknames troops gave it. Yellow peril shows up in unit diaries, usually written without humor. The pans they used were enormous, and once the heat hit, the mixture set fast, so the cooks had seconds to scrape and flip it before it fused into a sheet. One veteran said the best batches were the ones that stuck least. The worst batch he remembered ended up nailed to a board as a joke, and no one bothered to take it down. 2. Tinned bacon, compo rations. The tins were stacked in rows so tight that quartermasters joked they could build a wall out of them. Open one and the bacon came out in a solid block, pale fat clinging to everything. It was meant to be simple. Heat it, serve it, move on. The paperwork from the period makes it sound routine, yet different units reported completely different results. Some swore theirs tasted fine. Others said it was barely edible. No one seems to agree why. The army kept issuing it because it traveled well and didn't demand a proper kitchen. Fires, paraffin stoves, or nothing at all, like the bacon didn't care. That was the whole operational argument. There's a note from one supply depot claiming the tins were designed to withstand rough handling, though another document hints they dented far too easily. Hard to know which version is right. Storage was another headache. You'd have crates sitting near fuel drums, then the next batch would turn up beside medical supplies, as if placement didn't matter. At some camps, the fat cooled so fast it set like candle wax before the bacon even left the pan. One story that pops up concerns a unit trying to use the empty tins as makeshift cups. The rims were too sharp, so they dropped the idea. In colder weather though, soldiers just opened the tins and ate the contents cold because heating gear wasn't always available. The official guidance didn't mention that part. 3. Porridge made with salt water. People compare it to modern camping hacks, as if swapping fresh water for seawater is some clever trick. It wasn't. Early naval logs spell it out clearly. Porridge batches measured by the gallon, stirred with long-handled spoons, then thinned with salt water because the tanks ran low. Crews accepted it because there wasn't a choice. The entries get specific about quantities, then taper off into complaints that don't bother with measurements at all. Those shipboard practices drifted ashore whenever land units found their water points rationed or fouled. One report from 1941 describes engineers boiling what they had, realizing it still tasted wrong, and using it anyway. Another source claims some camps were told to avoid this method. Yet the same file shows cooks doing it days later. The contradictions don't resolve neatly. They just sit there, suggesting no one wanted to rewrite the orders each time conditions shifted. Porridge made this way didn't behave like normal porridge. It thickened faster. It clumped. Veterans said it carried a gritty edge they never managed to fix. The practice moved between units without any formal instruction. There's a note tucked into a medical officer's diary mentioning men scraping the bottom of the pot to make sure it hadn't burned. That small detail tells you more than the official paperwork ever does. 4. Bully beef, corned beef tins. One record mentions that the tins were stamped on machines borrowed from a firm that normally packed dog food. It sounds unrelated, but it fits once you realize how frantic the supply system became. Millions of tins had to move from factories to depots to field kitchens without slowing down. Bully beef slipped neatly into that rhythm. It didn't spoil easily. It didn't demand preparation. It just sat there, ready for whatever the day allowed. You'd see it turn up in field orders, supply notes, even kit inspections. The scale was wild. Crates stacked on truck beds, stores officers counting by weight instead of units because no one had the patience to tally each tin. Some batches were slightly different in texture, others leaned saltier, but no one stopped long enough to fix those quirks. You'd find men slicing it onto hard bread one week, then watching cooks mash it into stews the next. In between, a few units tried rendering the fat for frying other scraps, which never caught on. There's a stray note from a transport company arguing that the tins rattled too much in transit. The complaint went nowhere, which isn't surprising. When an army decides a product works, the rest tends to fall in line. And for all the jokes, bully beef did exactly what the system needed it to do. 5. M&V, meat and vegetable, stew tins. It was grey. That's the only part everyone agrees on. The rest drifts in and out of focus because the stew didn't behave like normal food. It sat in tins, heavy and vague, as if whoever made it decided colour didn't matter. Open it, and the contents slumped out in one slow movement. Then it just waited. No definite scent, no shape that made sense, only soft edges and a surface that never quite settled. Some men swore there were carrots in there. Others said they never saw a single one. The meat, if it was meat, broke apart the moment a spoon touched it. Nothing resisted. Nothing held its form. Short pauses followed those first bites. Then people just carried on eating. Trying to explain it means working backward from the end result, and the end result didn't give much away. The label promised meat and vegetables. It didn't specify what kind. That left plenty of room for speculation, and speculation filled the gaps more than the stew ever did. Consistency. Somewhere between thick soup and wet clay. Temperature. Whatever the fire or stove could manage. If the tin warmed unevenly, one side turned runny while the other clung stubbornly to the metal. A few stories mention soldiers heating it directly on coals, which warped the tin and made the contents wobble like it had opinions. None of that clarified anything. The stew occupied a strange space, too familiar to be alarming, too odd to be trusted, and for something so plain, it didn't always look plain. 6. Whale meat. People assume whale meat was some strange one-off experiment. It wasn't. It circulated through rations often enough that supply officers treated it like any other substitution. The official notes framed it as a straightforward replacement for beef, even though nothing about it lined up with what troops expected. The process on the ground looked simple. Crates came in, cooks unpacked them. Orders said, "Prepare as meat." Units then discovered cuts that were dark, dense, and stubborn. Short cooking times didn't work. Long ones made it worse. The guidance called it a reliable source of protein, which was accurate but didn't address the real issue. Every method led to the same sharp, oily finish that refused to blend with anything else. There was no version of preparation that solved the problem. The government carried on issuing it because calorie shortages forced their hand. Mess halls handled it because they had to. Soldiers reacted the same way across different units. Sliced, diced, boiled, fried, the flavor always pointed back to the sea. One quartermaster report mentions entire trays returning untouched. 7. Spam, American Lend-Lease. Some units treated spam like it had always been part of military life. That's how common it became once the Lend-Lease shipments started rolling in. Pallets arrived in steady waves, and wherever the tins landed, the routine shifted a little. Cooks found it easy to work with. Slice it, fry it, warm it in a pan of whatever else was going. There wasn't much ceremony to it, which suited most camps just fine. The reactions were all over the place. Some soldiers genuinely liked it, others kept their distance. Most fell somewhere in the middle, treating it as reliable enough to eat without giving it much thought. What stood out was how quickly people adapted. A tin might get shared cold on a long march, then reappear the next day crisped up beside potatoes. It filled gaps without creating new problems, and that alone set it apart from a lot of wartime rations. There's a quiet practicality behind the way troops talk about it in letters and diaries. They rarely praised it outright, but they didn't groan about it the way they did with bully beef. And that comparison comes up so often, it stops feeling like a comparison at all. It's simply the measure they used. 8. Tinned sausages. Tinned sausages created a kind of quiet standoff the moment the lid came off, mostly because no one could avoid noticing the jelly. It clung to the sausages in a way that made soldiers pause, even when they were hungry enough to eat almost anything. Some diaries mention men poking it with a spoon before committing to a bite, as if the extra second might reveal what the ingredients actually were. It never did. The sausages themselves were pale and soft, closer to a compromise than a meal. Fresh meat was rare, so these tins filled the gap by being predictable and easy to store. They heated fast. They traveled well. They didn't fall apart in transit. That was the logic behind them, even if the end result felt a long way from the sausages men remembered from home. A few lucky units fried them and swore it helped. Most just warmed them in the tin because there wasn't time or fuel for anything else. Suspicion lingered anyway. Troops joked about what might be inside, but the jokes usually came after the eating, not before. That alone says enough. 9. Tinned pilchards. Pilchards sat in the ration lists as if they were completely ordinary, which is why their reputation inside camps feels so out of step with how often they appeared. The tins looked harmless enough, but soldiers recognized them instantly. Small fish packed tight in tomato sauce or oil, soft bones included. You ate the whole thing because that was the point. High in protein, easy to ship, survived rough handling. On paper, a sensible choice. In practice, they rarely stayed with the person who received them. Men traded them away the moment rations were handed out. One tin might disappear in exchange for a cigarette. 2 tins could get you a bit of chocolate if you caught someone in a generous mood. A few men tolerated them, usually those already used to fish-heavy diets, but that never shifted the overall mood around them. Pilchards became a kind of informal currency. The odd part is how little variation shows up in accounts. Different units, different fronts, same reaction every time. The tins opened, the fish came out whole, the soft bones never caused trouble, and most of the meal ended up in someone else's hands. 10. Dehydrated potato, POM. POM always appeared in ration lists with a confidence that didn't match how anyone felt about it. The instructions were simple: add water, stir, serve. That was the whole pitch. Soldiers expected something close to mashed potato and ended up with a mixture that sat somewhere between food and filler. The powder absorbed liquid fast, almost too fast, and whatever came out of the pot held its shape in a way real potato never did. Cooks kept using it because it paired with anything. Meat, stew, bully beef, whatever turned up that day, POM acted as the buffer. It bulked out meals when nothing else was available, and that reliability made it unavoidable. Some units mastered the exact water ratio and managed a smoother batch. Others never bothered measuring and accepted whatever landed on the plate. Either way, no one mistook it for the real thing. The nickname stuck quickly. POM was shorter, easier, and captured the mood of eating it without saying much at all. One quartermaster's note describes men scraping leftover portions straight into buckets, which says more about its texture than any official description ever managed. 11. Tinned tomatoes. Wartime version. Tinned tomatoes carried a reputation for being more useful than enjoyable. The color varied from batch to batch, sometimes so faint it barely passed for red, and the liquid inside leaned toward thin and sharp, rather than rich. Even so, cooks reached for them constantly because they stretched whatever else was in the pot. A spoonful into a stew changed the whole thing, turning a thin meal into something closer to proper food. On quieter days, units heated the contents straight from the tin and called it soup. No one pretended it was impressive, but it warmed quickly and didn't require fussing with anything else. The acidity cut through the monotony of rations, which gave it a small edge over staples that relied on fat and salt alone. Soldiers noted the difference in letters, not as praise, just as a practical detail about what kept meals from feeling completely identical. It stayed on supply lists because it solved more problems than it caused, even if most of those problems had nothing to do with flavor. 12. Dehydrated vegetables. Dehydrated vegetables showed up in ration crates as dense blocks that didn't resemble anything they were supposed to replace. Carrots, onions, cabbage, reduced to shapes that looked more like fuel than food. Cooks dropped them into boiling water and waited for them to revive, but the result never matched the ingredients listed on the packaging. The pieces softened, but only just, and whatever color they regained didn't come with much flavor. Units kept using them because they extended stews without adding weight to supply lines. One crate could feed an entire company for days, at least in theory. Whether the vegetables offered any real vitamins became a running question. Medical officers encouraged their use anyway, pointing out that the alternative was letting diets collapse into nothing but meat and starch. Soldiers weren't convinced. Most descriptions talk about the texture more than the nutrition. 13. Swede and turnip. Mash. Some kitchens stored swedes and turnips in open piles outside, uncovered. On its own, that sounds like poor housekeeping. It mattered because those heaps meant an almost endless supply a few steps from the pot, so when rations ran thin or deliveries were late, the cook could walk out, grab a sackful, and guarantee there'd be something to ladle out. The routine barely changed. Chop, boil until they gave up any resistance, then mash the lot together into a single mound that behaved more like a building material than a side dish. And that one decision to rely so heavily on hardy roots stretched all sorts of meals that would otherwise have fallen apart. In one winter camp, men joked they could tell the day of the week by how much mash was on the plate. They weren't far off. Swede and turnip mash turned up next to bully beef under M&V stew beside pom, because quartermasters knew those crops would grow in poor soil and survive rough weather, and the ministry knew they were cheaper than relying on imported potatoes. It didn't matter that the mash was dull to eat, or that the stringy bits stuck around no matter how long it sat in the pot. What mattered, from the system's point of view, was that a field that once grew animal feed was now quietly supplying enough roots to keep an entire battalion from going hungry. Still, every account agrees on one thing. They worked well enough to avoid bigger problems, even if no one pretended they tasted like vegetables. 14. Hardtack biscuits. People tend to assume the break-your-teeth jokes about hardtack are exaggerations. Wartime dental reports suggest otherwise, with repeated mentions of cracked fillings and chipped edges after meals that featured biscuits more than once a day. On paper, they were simple: square, dry, flour-based biscuits following a pattern carried over from the First World War. Officially, a few tweaks were made to ingredients over the years, yet soldiers kept writing that they couldn't tell one batch from another. They were issued because they solved storage problems, not because anyone enjoyed them. Hardtack rode in crates, sat in damp huts, moved across fronts, and emerged almost unchanged after months of being ignored. To eat them at all, men usually needed help from something else. The biscuits went into tea, stew, even condensed milk if that happened to be on hand, and only after a decent soak did they surrender enough to bite through. Accounts disagree on how long they needed to sit before they were safe for weak teeth. Some say minutes, others insist half an hour still left the centers firm, with sharp corners waiting at the bottom of the mug. 15. Liberation bread, sawdust bread. The loaves came out of the ovens with a flat grey crust that didn't crack when handled. Wartime bakeries in Britain, especially those supplying large camps around Wiltshire and the Midlands, mixed wood pulp into dough to stretch limited flour stocks. Records from 1941 mention ratios as high as 7 to 10%, depending on the mill. Machines meant for standard brown bread struggled with the mixture because the pulp held water differently, so dough hooks stalled and bakers had to shorten mixing times. The loaves barely rose. They cooled into blocks that weighed more than they looked like they should. Supply officers logged them as fortified bread, a label repeated in public notices that framed the pulp as added fiber, though internal correspondence shows the government expected complaints and tried to keep mills consistent across counties. Quartermaster reports from Scotland, where a few rural bakeries refused the pulp entirely and ended up shipping shorter batches, which then forced nearby units to adopt ration cuts for several weeks. Soldiers everywhere else caught on fast anyway. They called it liberation bread, partly as a joke and partly because the name stuck after a single newspaper cartoon. And by the time cooks sliced it for stew thickening or toasted it to make it tolerable, the joke had already spread further than the official explanation. 16. Oatcakes. Emergency ration. Oatcakes were issued as an emergency ration, and the paperwork treated them as a guaranteed fallback rather than a real meal. The official sheets list them at roughly 3 ounces per pack, pressed into uniform discs that held together just long enough to be counted as transport-proof. They were dry, they were dense, and they were meant to sit untouched until every other option ran out. Records from depot stores in Derby and York mention the same thing again and again. Soldiers didn't complain about the oatcakes themselves, only the moments that forced them to rely on them. Units on long marches kept them in side pouches because they didn't spoil, and patrols used them during stretches when supply lines lagged a day or two behind. Reports describe men breaking them apart over canteen cups to soften the edges, which worked only a little, and there's a line in one quartermaster note explaining that their satiating quality came from the sheer effort required to chew through a whole one. The official guidance claimed they were nutritionally balanced for short-term use, but that line never convinced anyone who actually had to eat them. They stayed in the system through the end of rationing, then quietly disappeared once fresh bread and proper field biscuits became easier to produce. 17. Bromide tea, anti-libido tea. So was the tea really laced with bromide, or was it just barrack room folklore that never died? The conclusion most historians arrive at is fairly blunt. There's no hard evidence of a systematic bromide in the tea program, but there is mountains of evidence that soldiers were convinced something was going on. Official ration scales list tea, sugar, milk, water, and fuel, but no bromide additive. Medical records mention bromide as a sedative in controlled doses, usually as tablets or mixtures, not shoveled into giant urns in cookhouses. Yet letters, memoirs, and post-war interviews repeat the joke in slightly different forms. "Must be the bromide," said whenever someone felt tired, uninterested, or stuck somewhere remote with no women in sight. The story spread so widely that new recruits often heard it within days of arriving, long before they learned where the cookhouse even was. That kind of consistency makes the rumor itself part of the ration system, whether the chemical ever reached the mug or not. What makes it stranger is how normal the tea seems in every description. No one talks about a bitter aftertaste or odd color. It's always described as standard, strong army tea, poured from huge urns and swallowed without ceremony in canteens from Kent to Cairo. Some medical officers went on record after the war saying it would have been pointless anyway, because the doses required to blunt libido would also leave men sluggish and unfit for duty, which doesn't show up in training reports or fitness records. At the same time, bromide does appear in pharmacy logs for hospitals and convalescent depots, which keeps the door slightly open for small-scale local experiments no one fully wrote down. Other armies had their own something in the food legends, saltpeter in American camps, for example. But the British version locked itself onto tea and stayed there. In the end, you're left with a drink that, by every surviving account, looked like tea, tasted like tea, and still carried a reputation for doing something no one has ever been able to prove. 18. Chicory coffee. Chicory root grows fast, and that small fact ended up shaping how thousands of soldiers started their mornings. When imported coffee vanished from ration lists in 1940, the ministry leaned on whatever could be roasted, ground, and brewed in bulk, which is how chicory shifted from a niche product to a daily stand-in. It wasn't chosen for flavor, it was chosen because docks weren't receiving the real thing. Early batches came from factories in Liverpool and Hull, packed into tins that looked suspiciously like pre-war coffee tins. And that similarity mattered because it kept complaints from piling up immediately. Soldiers learned the truth soon enough. The liquid was brown, it was strong in its own way, and it carried a sharp edge that never quite matched what people expected from a morning drink. One file from 1942 mentions a single regiment that tried mixing remaining coffee grounds with chicory to stretch the supply. It didn't help. The flavor skewed even further off course, and the quartermaster dropped the experiment after 2 weeks because the mixture clogged urn filters and slowed breakfast service. Some mess crews got creative with additions: condensed milk, extra sugar, even cocoa powder when they could get it. But these tweaks only softened the edges and often created new problems like sticky residue in the equipment, which had to be dealt with before inspections. Chicory stayed in circulation until shipping lanes stabilized in late 1944. After that, tins of actual coffee began to reappear, and the substitute slid back into obscurity where it had started. 19. Tinned milk, condensed. By the time rationing eased, whole units were already hooked on tea made with condensed milk because that was the only version they'd been able to produce for years, and everything about how they used it traces back to how the tins were engineered and shipped in the first place. Each can was sealed under heat, stacked in bulk crates that survived rough transport, and concentrated enough that a single tin could cover several brews or, when conditions pushed it, serve as a quick source of calories straight off a spoon. Supply records note that the consistency meant it blended quickly in boiling water, which kept queues moving in crowded cookhouses, while a side note from a depot in Sussex mentions tins bending if stored too close to stoves, a quirk that didn't affect safety but did lead to a handful of accidental leaks. Condensed milk also shaped habits in a way few other ration items managed, because once fresh milk deliveries resumed, many soldiers refused the change and stuck to the sweet, heavy style they'd learned on campaign, which leaves one question sitting there long after the logistics were sorted: how long did that preference actually last once they went home? 20. Spotted dick, steamed pudding. Spotted dick sat on ration sheets as a perfectly ordinary pudding, which is the only straightforward thing about it. Early wartime kitchen logs describe batches made from suet, flour, and a small scoop of raisins measured out by weight, then steamed in large metal basins for close to 2 hours, a process that tied up equipment in a way quartermasters didn't especially like but tolerated because most crews finished the day fuller and in noticeably better moods afterward. That reaction makes more sense when you look over mess records showing how rarely anything warm and sweet appeared, though one line from a field kitchen in Kent notes a version bulked out with extra flour that turned almost rubbery, an experiment no one repeated. It's hard to miss how this one dish slid across different settings without changing much. At home, it showed up on school menus, in factory canteens, and in cheap cafes. On campaign, it kept the same base ingredients and the same steaming ritual, even when cooks improvised with makeshift lids or dented pots. That consistency stands out because most other puddings of the era shifted depending on what came in, yet Spotted Dick usually held its shape, sometimes with fewer raisins or a smaller portion, but recognizably the same things served in barracks across Britain. There's also the strain of contradiction running through the notes. Command encouraged light, easily prepared items, though they continued approving a pudding that tied up burners for hours and soaked up valuable sweet. Cooks didn't argue. They kept producing it on quiet days when supplies allowed, and men queued for a slice without asking what had been substituted or stretched. One supply list from 1943 mentions a batch with barely any raisins because the shipment arrived half-spoiled, yet the pudding still went out on schedule. The page ends with the addendum that the basin lid didn't seal properly that day, which leaves the last thing we know about that meal as a line describing steam leaking steadily into a cold prep tent. People assume carrot fudge was a clever wartime treat that everyone secretly loved. It wasn't. The Ministry of Food pushed it hard once sugar rations tightened in the early 1940s, printing recipes that called for grated carrots, a few ounces of precious sugar, a lump of margarine, and maybe a splash of orange essence, all boiled together until it thickened and then pressed into shallow tins to set. The idea was simple on paper: use homegrown carrots, stretch the tiny sugar allowance, and still promise something called fudge on the tea table. On ration books and posters, that sounded obedient and thrifty. A clearer picture shows up in accounts from church halls and WVS canteens that actually made the stuff. One report describes a batch cut into 30 small squares for a children's party, each piece slightly damp and bending at the edges rather than snapping, with several children eating a corner, putting it back on the plate, and quietly moving on to the plain biscuits. Adults finished most of it, more out of politeness than enthusiasm. The government treated it as a model recipe. Carrot desserts turned up in leaflets, newspaper columns, and radio talks, sometimes with cheerful cartoons of smiling roots standing in for sugar, and recipe writers leaned on phrases like delicious sweetmeat and treat your family, while carefully avoiding any detailed comparison with actual pre-war fudge made from condensed milk and a full cup of sugar. On rationing forms, it sat in the same mental space as other make-do dishes that ticked every official box, but didn't match the memory of what they were replacing. One household diary from 1943 notes making carrot fudge exactly once, then rewriting the recipe in the margin with extra syrup added when available, which says more than any slogan about how people adapted it. In other homes, the name survived while the method drifted, with some families dropping the boiling stage altogether and serving the mixture soft in a bowl because there was no point pretending it would firm up into neat cubes. By the end of the war, the official recipe was still there in pamphlets and clippings, but in at least one set of handwritten notes it appears with a single line beside it. Most of this left on the plate. 22. Tinned treacle pudding. Treacle pudding was one of the few tins men actually hid. It came ready-made in squat cans from a handful of British producers, already cooked and soaked in dark syrup. Issue was irregular, never enough for everyone, and some units only saw it when supply officers had room on a truck or a crate turned up from a different depot. When it did appear, the routine was simple. The sealed tin sat in hot water until the contents loosened. Then the base was opened and the pudding pushed out in one solid column onto a mess tin lid or enamel plate, sliced with whatever knife was cleanest, and shared out in thick, collapsing chunks that were far sweeter than anything else on the table that week. Official paperwork doesn't always agree on whether it counted as part of the standard sweet ration or as an occasional item, which fits with how unevenly it seems to have reached different camps. Men treated it less like dessert and more like a small event. Some held a tin back for a mate's birthday, others waited for the end of a rough patrol cycle, and there are letters that mention swapping cigarettes or extra tea just to be promised a slice when someone finally opened theirs. In more than one kit inventory, everything listed is standard issue except for one extra line that doesn't need explanation: a single dented treacle pudding tin, wrapped in cloth at the bottom of a pack. 23. Naffy pies, when available. A small detail often missed is that naffy pies weren't free. Men had to buy them with their own pay, which already tells you how different they were from the usual issue. The pies came in shallow tins or paper wraps depending on the supplier, each batch pulled from whatever regional bakery the local NAAFI branch contracted, and the filling could swing from recognizable minced beef to something closer to thick gravy, holding a few strands of meat together. What puzzles historians is how inconsistent the records are. Some camps mention a weekly delivery logged at exactly 40 dozen units, while others only note pies received with no count and no description of what went into them, as if the exact ingredients weren't worth writing down. A few surviving price cards show a narrow range, 3p in 1940, rising to around 6p 2 years later. Yet the diaries that mention them talk about queues forming fast, which suggests demand stayed high even when the quality was anyone's guess. The pastry itself caused its own debates. Some accounts say it flaked apart as soon as it was warmed. Others call it dense enough to pick up without a plate, and there's at least one photograph where the crust looks more like a compacted lid than anything baked. None of that stopped men from lining up for them after long shifts, And the simple fact that someone paid full wages for a pie they couldn't quite identify stays more striking than anything in the official notes. 24. Red Cross parcels. What made these parcels so effective at lifting morale? The contents weren't mysterious. Chocolate bars, loose cigarettes, small tins of fruit, biscuits that held up to transport. But the way they reached camps gave them a different weight entirely. Each one came packed to a strict template, standard-sized tins folded into cardboard dividers, cigarettes laid flat to keep them from breaking, and a slip noting whether it came from a family contribution or a pooled Red Cross shipment. The transport chain behind them was tighter than many expect. Parcels were gathered at national depots, logged by number, and passed through neutral intermediaries like the Swiss in 1943, who helped ensure they moved across borders with fewer delays. A single crate might hold 40 individual parcels, each wrapped in waxed paper to keep moisture out, and the crate moved through inspection points where seals were sometimes broken and reattached with no explanation, which left gaps in the paperwork that still show up in archives. POW accounts describe ration tables where these parcels arrived in batches, sometimes weekly, sometimes after long gaps that no record fully explains. The difference usually came down to railway capacity or sudden routing changes rather than any formal policy. One detail stands out. The tins were chosen for durability, not flavor, which is why so many survivors mention opening the same brands decades apart. But the real puzzle is how often parcels disappeared between depots and camps without anyone agreeing on where the chain failed. 25. Compo ration chocolate. This chocolate was never meant to be enjoyed. In the composite ration box, it sat in its own compartment, a stubby brown bar wrapped in dull paper, stamped with the military broad arrow so there was no doubt it was official issue. A standard piece weighed only a few ounces, but was calculated to carry a set number of calories, which is why it turned up everywhere from North Africa to Italy in exactly the same squat, unappealing shape. Men on long marches learned quickly what it was for. You broke off a corner, let it soften in your mouth, and waited for the slow, claggy hit of energy that followed, because eating the whole slab at once could make you feel sick before it ever made you feel strong. One account from a desert unit describes a single bar being passed round a section at dusk, each man taking a thumbnail-sized shard while their normal rations sat untouched, since this was the only thing that could be trusted not to spoil in the heat. The recipe explains the rest. High in fat, low in cocoa, packed more for stability than taste, it was engineered to stay solid in conditions that would turn normal chocolate into a puddle in minutes, and that trade-off shows up in almost every description of it as something you endured rather than looked forward to. Some men shaved it into mess tin porridge, some crumbled it into tea, and a few simply kept it in a pocket as a psychological safety net, knowing they could chew through it if things really went wrong. No one queued at the NAFI counter to buy extra bars of Compo chocolate. It belonged to a different category in their heads, sitting alongside iron rations and emergency water rather than treats, which is why stories about food rewards almost never mention it unless something had gone badly off plan. Even years later, veterans who could barely recall brands of peacetime sweets could still describe that service bar exactly: a flat, anonymous block that outlasted heat, damp, and rough handling, and often outlasted a man's desire to ever eat it.